Welcome back to another episode of Reading Rehab. I am Mike Brown, joined by
Pat Healy.
and no Brian Gardner again today, but that's okay. We are discussing stretching and specifically discussing conflicting explanatory approaches in flexibility training under consideration of physiology, a narrative review. This was published last month, May 2024, in Sports Medicine. And I think Pat and I were both generally underwhelmed by this, but we will get into it. I honestly, the first two sentences I think were kind of indicative of what the rest of the article is going to be like. So in the first sentence, they say, in sports practice, improving physical fitness requires a well-planned and structured training process. Sure. And then the next one, clear definitions and understanding the underlying mechanisms, increasing range of motion via different methods is a vital prerequisite for developing training regimens. That seems like a big jump to me. It's essentially like, oh, you need a well-planned, structured process. Here's range of motion training, instead of like, I don't know, having a sentence or two to be like, part of this process is training range of motion. Range of motion is important for benefits.
Just range of motion.
Yeah, it's like, it seemed very abrupt. And then, honestly, that was the only thing I highlighted in the introduction. I did make a couple comments, like, they didn't explain why flexibility is important. They just said, like, it's a prerequisite for training plans, but didn't say, like, why.
Yeah. And it's like, it didn't give clinical scenarios between, like, if someone is like post-op, then it's like, well, then yes, range of motion is important, but nothing really given that here. But the only thing I had going through here was just, they gave the different techniques that have been discussed about improving range of motion, being like foam rolling, massage, just static stretching. And they're just talking about like how there's been questions that come around about like possible underlying mechanisms between these interventions.
Yeah, so they're trying to explain why these things do what they do.
Why do you get elastic from stretching?
So I mean, diving right in, overview about the most popular training protocols and results to enhance flexibility. Honestly, I didn't highlight anything in here. They just talked about their static stretching, dynamic stretching, PNF stretching.
Yeah, no, nothing else really. And then they kind of go into the next part, which is acute flexibility effects. And then first sentence right there, regarding these improvements, the literature provides no clear evidence which stretching techniques should be prioritized within a single training session. And then other things going through here is just no significant acute range of motion, differences between reviewed stretching techniques independent of stretch intensity, sex, or training level. But then, a lot of these things, as they stated, look at prolonged static stretching, so like over 60 seconds per muscle group. But they wanted to state that they did not recommend this in your warm-up routine because it could be harmful on like subsequent performance. So.
Yeah, I highlighted the same thing. Only other thing I had highlighted in that section was thixotropic effects. I had never heard of that word before, so I looked it up, and it's a non-Newtonian property of fluids and gels that are viscous under static conditions, but flow when shaken, whatever that means. And it's interesting that they bring it up. I guess just because I haven't heard of it doesn't mean it's like not a thing in the body, but I feel like they talk about that in relation to like the musculotendinous unit. And I just don't understand how that relates to muscles and tendons, because they're not a fluid. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think we would have to look into it, because I know there's been like some like fluid dynamics and like stuff coming out for like Achilles stuff, or like there's been things working on in that realm. So I don't know. I can't speak much to it because I don't know. I'm kind of uneducated in that sense, but I don't know. Maybe we should look into it. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, and that is something I have looked into a tiny bit as well. And I don't doubt that there is fluid in the tendon as well, especially in a like tendinopathy or some sort of pathology with the tendon. But I just don't get how stretching can change what like that effect. I guess because they don't give a definition of like how this is related to muscles. So just going off of my Googled definition, I really don't understand how it relates to these structures in the body, which is unfortunate because they mentioned it a couple times.
Yes, they
did. But so then later, I think this is interesting. And they say full range of motion resistance training can be considered a type of loaded dynamic stretching, which seems interesting to me. And then one of my favorite sentences in the whole article, they cite their previous research that showed no significant differences between acute range of motion increases in the calf muscles comparing high volume stretching 1 hour with an exhausting calf raise routine consisting of 5 by 12 reps performed over the full range. I don't know. I feel like at least for athletes, 5 sets of 12 reps of calf raises, even if they're single leg, really shouldn't be that exhausting. So I feel like the modifier exhausting before calf raises kind of shows like their bias for this. And then also high volume stretching of 1 hour. Like, I know I am never having anyone stretch for 1 hour straight, even if they're post-op ACL and like we're trying to get back extension and flexion and doing like low load, long duration things. Like that long duration is like 10 to 20 minutes. Like, it just seems wild to me that like you would sit in a like plantar flexion or dorsiflexion stretch for an hour. But,
like kind of same thoughts that you had, where it's like, what's the clinical relevance we have going on here? So, but I think that comes up even more when we get into like chronic. So, or not chronic. Chronic.
They talk about long duration stretches a lot. So then that's the last thing I have in that section. The next section, acute range of motion improvements due to enhanced muscle temperature. They're essentially trying to say that that stretching increases your muscle temperature, which maybe. I guess that's part of like the warm-up thought process. And where they, I guess.
Well, I like the sentence they have where they say, as illicit training interventions improve flexibility compared with an inactive control, these findings merely support the notion that overall activity appears to be sufficient in comparison to a state of rest. So
I highlighted that too because I just feel like that's the wrong takeaway from that personally. Because in theory, the only difference between the two groups is the intervention. So it's not because one group is in an overall state of rest, because they're still doing, in theory, the same stuff as the other group, because that's how randomization works. So really the only difference between the two of them is the intervention. So it's not overall activity, it's the intervention caused the difference. So I don't know. Yeah, I also thought that was interesting. They later say comparing and contrasting stretching and foam rolling responses to the effects of jogging, cycling, resistance training, heat application, cryotherapy. Their own research was not able to confirm the necessity of using specialized routines to acutely enhance flexibility or passive peak torque. And I guess to me, this statement could be taken multiple ways, but to me, this tells me like, if there's no difference between all of these things, why would I not do jogging, cycling, resistance training? Because they have other benefits rather than purely a flexibility benefit.
Yeah, more bang for your buck, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So I honestly don't know what they were trying to demonstrate with that sentence. Just I guess that you can stretch and foam roll. But I don't know. I also think I was getting slightly frustrated reading this article, and I could have put my own frustration.
Put your own tone to it.
yeah. Like I could have been looking for things that weren't actually there for this, and I fully recognize that as well. So I'm trying to give the authors the benefit of the doubt, but this just got me heated a little bit.
Got you overall fired up compared to a state of rest.
Yeah. They got me warm.
I really have nothing else from this acute range of motion improvement section here. So looking at the chronic flexibility effects now, again, they keep on bringing up the sentences of how there's like no improvements in response to things such as like foam rolling, and then like similar to stretching, ongoing discussion regarding like the underlying mechanisms of like these modalities such as foam rolling. But then it goes down into this discussion of like pain tolerance, and how is it this range of motion increase just enhancing someone's pain tolerance, so it's not really changing any like stiffness. And that gets down into, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, but when we get down near the bottom, they talked about how like stretching intensity is like really important for structural adaptations, but most intensity is measured using like subjective pain. But then they go on to say that like to conduct well-designed stretching studies, they need to have like an actual like tension for the intensity, like to make it objective. But it's like, then, why have it be a pain threshold thing if you're just going to try to put the number for the actual tension? You know what I mean? Like if you're saying your possible mechanism is like improving the pain tolerance and threshold, then why aren't we using that as the metric to see if that is what improves it? And instead be like, I understand they're trying to see like structural changes, and then they get into like possible problems with like measuring that also. I know I'm jumping ahead here, but you see where I'm going here, where it's kind of like, if you're saying this is making one thing better, why are we trying to look at a different thing instead? But
yeah, I feel like that happened a lot in this paper. The one thing that got me just in that first paragraph with the chronic flexibility is like they say full range of motion resistance training might be considered as dynamic loading stretching, which seems interchangeable with stretching routines. I don't know. Again, as I said, I would 100 times out of 100 rather do a full range of motion resistance training routine than purely a stretching routine with someone.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I feel like a hot topic right now is like loaded mobility work, you know?
Yeah.
Like, kind of like in that sense where it's like, yeah, you're not going to be like racking up super heavy weight, but just like putting yourself under some load while working through your full range of motion for any movement, really.
Yeah, I'm working with a man now who is essentially seeing me purely for mobility. Like he's a very strong person. Like he can deadlift 500 pounds, but he's got very little, like especially like hip range of motion. And so one of the things we're doing is like in RDL, not with a lot of weight compared to like what he normally can do, but then just working on going through the full range. Same with like an overhead squat, like where he's overhead squatting essentially just the bar right now, which is like I compared it to him overhead squatting just the bar is like me overhead squatting a dowel rod. And it's purely to just work on flexibility. Like I could and mobility. I could have him just hold static stretches for a while, but I personally feel like he is getting a lot more benefit out of actually moving into and out of the range rather than just holding.
Yeah, I think also like, you know, if we're going to be talking clinically now, doing something that is like salient for your patient, like I can't see many patients who would uphold to holding a stretch for let alone 5 minutes. And then you try to tell them to do it for an hour. But then it's like in your situation, giving a man who already is lifting, it's like he sees it as something that's related to the task and something that is working on his impairments. And it's like, oh yeah, why would I not do this? Because this is already something I'm familiar and interested with. So
yeah, exactly. And again, another highlight I had on this that's similar to that statement above is they say, even though it is not clarified if the eccentric portion of full range of motion resistance training or the mechanical tension to extend muscle length can be considered the underlying mechanisms, stretching alone seems sufficient to induce similar adaptations compared with full range of motion resistance training, which is not limited to flexibility changes. And then saying that resistance training is recognized for promoting maximal strength gains and hypertrophy, which one of those is citing himself. I guess I would need to look into this more, but it does, I guess the limited amount of research I've done in both of these in like this area is typically with like immobile people in they're being stretched for like a stupid long time, like most of the day. And that's when you start seeing muscle gains and hypertrophy. And I feel like that's mostly just because since they're immobile, any sort of stimulus to the muscle is going to be overloading to that muscle. So therefore it will adapt by improving strength and hypertrophy. But I could be wrong. I haven't read these articles, so maybe they're looking at 3 sets of 30 seconds, and that's getting some gains. But yeah, then we both just skipped a lot.
Yeah, if you took biology class, like you could just skip 3.1.
Yeah.
We go into the deep tunnel of sarcomeres and Z-discs. So
yeah, they're talking specifically about like sarcomere change and like sarcomere genesis, which I don't know, that went over my head. Same with the response matrix modeling too. Getting into like the stretching causes like certain gene expression to like change the phenotype of the muscles, which I'm like, whoa. Which I don't know. It's given the rest of the article where I wasn't like prior to this, where I was like, they're kind of making weird, like they're kind of equating weird things here. I don't know if I can trust what they're saying here. Now they start talking about things I don't know, and that makes me trust it further just because I'm like, I don't know if this is actually right. So I'm immediately skeptical.
Yeah. So
but then
going straight to the method problems.
yeah.
First sentence there. Although logical in theory, no direct evidence could be found for serial sarcomere accumulation in humans. And then first sentence of that next paragraph. It is speculated that serial sarcomere accumulation occurs in humans. However, it is complicated to directly determine this phenomenon. So it's like, wait, so it happened. You're telling me it happens, but we don't know it happens. Now they tell you why, and it's because when doing this on like animal studies, you have to kill the animal to get the actual test. So might be a problem there, but
yeah, the IRB isn't letting that one pass.
yeah, and so then they just went into other stretching examples they had, where they had the 1 to 3 by 60 seconds of stretching with 17 exercises, which if you do the math is roughly an hour. And then also one that had 33 minutes of plantar flexion stretching. But then they went into saying how small stretching volumes and durations were not sufficient to increase the muscle cross-sectional area, while higher volumes, up to 7 hours per week, consistently showed muscle hypertrophy. So
that's so much stretching.
Yeah, it's just
an hour a day.
Yeah, and then the last part that I highlighted was what I already discussed, where talked about how a lot of intensity has been driven by subjective pain perception, and they are trying to quantify it now under tension, so they can actually like get some studies about like, can you actually change tissue qualities based on a certain tension of stretch? I'm interested how that method would be completed. But yeah, because right now it's kind of, outside of the animal studies, a lot of it is like just subjective from what it sounds like, or objective with super long stretches. So
yeah. I don't have anything else to add on there. So I actually skipped the further potential mechanisms 3.41. Not skipped, but like I didn't highlight anything. They really
I just didn't read it. Just went over
that. They talk about blood flow restriction possibly being
it's in everything. It's in everything now. You can't read a single paper about blood flow restriction, I swear.
Yeah, but they're not even talking about like specifically BFR. That my understanding is they're saying like when you stretch a muscle or a tendon, like it causes the capillaries to compress and just like get rid of the blood in the area. That's my understanding. But yeah, so then like going into practical applications in sports practice and research, I feel like this is where they kind of like double back on all the things they were saying before. So I don't know. Again, maybe they're actually anti-stretching and I'm just, straw manning them in my head or something. But so they say it is not mandatory to perform stretching, as resistance training performed over the full range of motion resulted in similar adaptations, which is why I would prefer to do that. They say therefore, when aiming to increase active range of motion, there might be different ways to induce high degrees of mechanical tension to greater muscle lengths. Considering full range of motion resistance training as a type of loaded dynamic stretching would be one way to include active movements over the available muscle lengths. So again, saying, hey, let's do full muscle length exercises rather than lots of stretching. And then later, based on the outline literature, it can be recommended to use isolated stretching exercises to improve individual joint range of motion, while full range of motion resistance training can be considered a more economical method to induce high degrees of mechanical tension and longer muscle lengths, thus improving full body active flexibility long-term compared to stretching. I actually really like that sentence. I feel like that's one of the better like key takeaways from this article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. Got nothing else to add there.
Yeah. So that's that article. I feel like it was very much a like you had me in the first half section, and
yeah. So
then,
I guess my takeaway
wrap up well.
Yeah, you're not going to catch me static stretching anytime soon.
Yeah.
No, it's still just like context. Like obviously, I think I agree with you where it's like if you're trying to get true like adaptation to like muscle length, like yeah, let's do some load. But I think if we're talking like team aspect, like I've heard of other coaches that use like static stretching not as like let's get you more flexible and let's improve your flexibility and like prevent injury, but like they use it to like mask just like social time as a way to like kickstart recovery, where it's like, all right, we're all going to stretch after this run now, not because I want to improve your guys' flexibility and, prevent DOMs, but actually because I want you guys just to like chill out with each other for 10, 15 minutes and just like, hang out and start to kickstart that parasympathetic,
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that's about it. That's all I got. That was my big thing. Big brain moment.
Yeah, I like that using stretching as a social activity, which if that's the goal, go for it. I also like there's, as you said earlier, like there's a time and a place for stretching. I think especially after like a joint surgery, stretching is super important. I guess my bias with like prescribing stretching exercises is generally less like static hold, like okay, hold this for 3 sets of 30 seconds, the classic prescription. And I prefer to like go back and forth through the full range of motion that is available for them, and then try and essentially increase how far you can go each rep. So like a classic like for knees, like doing a supine heel slide, in each rep you're trying to get a little bit more motion each one. I guess I've found success with that, but I also haven't had a very long career, so I could be missing something. But yeah, I think that's a good place to cut it. So that has been another episode of Reading Rehab. As always, we appreciate if you listened this far. Please be sure to follow us on Instagram at Reading Rehab Pod. And if you like what we do, give us a nice rating on Spotify or Apple Music. Thanks.